My name's Sacha from the Warehouse Project and PARKLIFE in Manchester. And I've been asked to choose 5 things which I do in my favourite city, the city I live in, Manchester. So I was thinking about it on the way in this morning, and I think the first thing I'd suggest is something that brings everybody together. It doesn't matter which demographic you're from, where you were brought up, which religion you are. There's one thing that brings most people together, and that's actually football. And I think the Premiership is actually the hardest league in the whole of the world. The rest of the world actually looks at the Premiership, see what's going on. And at the moment, as we record this, you look at number 1 and number 2. It says Manchester, Manchester. It says Manchester United first. I'm a Red. I've been told not to go into too much about that. But I would, in my opinion, certainly, it's within walking distance, but maybe jump in a cab, go to Old Trafford, go and have a look at the ground. If you can get a ticket to get in there, which is extremely difficult, I try and soak up the atmosphere. But the whole Sir Maplesby Way, the whole history, you can get a tour at Old Trafford. It's certainly one of the things I do. The second thing I do, and these aren't in any particular order, is look at probably my favourite building in the whole of Manchester. And to me it's quite bizarre, because when I was growing up, the building itself was derelict, and I've always thought of it almost like a huge armadillo that's just sat in the middle of the city. And that's now, used to be called GMX, it's now called Manchester Central. And there's so much history to it. It was originally, I think it was built in 1880. It was built to connect Manchester to London, to St Pancras train station in London. And then they closed it in the late 60s, and it literally lay there derelict for 12 years. Reopened again in the late 80s, and there's been so many phenomenal concerts that have been put on in that building. All in all, it's about 10,000 square metres. And if you're lucky enough to actually walk in there when there's nothing on, it's just a vast, vast empty space, but the ceiling is so special, it's all glass. Geeky fact, it's actually the second biggest roof span, second biggest train station roof span in the whole of the UK. It's grade 2 listed, and it's phenomenal. We've been to events there, concerts there, and when you're inside and the sun's coming down and you see it come through the glass, it's an incredible experience. So I'd definitely pop your head into that. So that was my favourite building. Then there are 2 areas that I think anyone visiting Manchester should really visit. And I'll start off with the newest area, an area that sort of over the last 3 years has really come into its own. And it's an area called Spinningfields. And when Spinningfields was first developed, or when the idea first was touted around, I think it was given the nickname, the ghost town. No one actually thought it would work, because it wasn't exactly completely central to the main streets like Market Street. It's a little bit further down Deansgate. But actually, all the higher end brands have moved in there now, like Giorgio Armani, one of my favourite shops, Flannels, is in there. And it's like a village within the city. You can spend all day there. In the summer, you can sit on the lawns, you can have a drink in the deck chairs whilst watching films. They have endless restaurants in there. 2 of my favourite restaurants are based in Spinningfields. One which, in my opinion, most certainly deserves a Michelin star, and that's Manchester House, which I think Manchester House is my favourite restaurant in the city. There's also the French as well. It's a great restaurant. It's not in Spinningfields. But my second favourite restaurant in the city is Australasia, which does great sushi. But you can spend all day there, going from bar to bar, to restaurants, all the clothes shops. There's loads of things going on. I'd definitely recommend an outing to Spinningfields. So alongside Spinningfields is another area which my office is actually located in, a place called CASTLEFIELD. And then again, that's just right on the edge of the city centre. It's a 5-minute walk. And to me, CASTLEFIELD's really special, because when I was growing up, it was full of derelict buildings, and it was the area that you really didn't want to go to. And a couple of visionaries have really turned it around. Jim Ramsbottom sort of, I think, kick-started the whole process. And then somebody who I really look up to in the city, a guy called Tom Bloxham. He's not a Manc, he's an adopted Manc. He redeveloped a lot of the areas in Castlefield and Manchester in a whole, actually. But I bought my office off Urban Splash, which is Tom Bloxham, and you just wouldn't recognise it if you compared it to 10, 15 years ago. But Castlefield's really great because it's where The River Irwell comes together with the Bridgewater Canal, and I think you can spend hours walking along the canals in Manchester. You can get a real feel for sort of the post-industrial period, and you walk through some really raw moments, and you can look at the iron under the bridges, and you can get a real feel for what old Manchester used to be like. And Manchester used to be, well, with many things, it was called the Cottonopolis of the world. Most of the cotton actually came from Manchester at one stage. That's why there's so many textile factories buried around the canals, and that's how they used to bring all the cotton down there. So it's really interesting to walk along and actually get a feel for the old, gritty Manchester. And there's something about the smell and the scene. You can really feel how it used to be decades and decades ago, if not centuries ago. So I think that's something really nice, something special. And it's good to start off. There's a bar called Duke's 92 where they've got the original lock house that's still there, and you can see barges coming in using the lock. And that's where I'd recommend you start the walk off. So no, that's another great place. So my final recommendation, actually I can't use my final recommendation because I was going to recommend having a photograph taken outside the Salford Lads Club, but the person who did this previous to me, Clint Boone from Inspire Carpets, has already mentioned that. So I'll try and sneak it in quickly. If you get a chance, people will argue Salford's not Manchester, Manchester's not Salford, and there definitely is a distinction between the two, but I do class it as Manchester. And I try and have a photo taken outside there because undoubtedly the most important bands that come out of the 80s, the Smiths, had the most famous cover, the most famous picture taken outside Salford Lads Club by a photographer called Stephen Wright, so that's well worth popping into. But the last two places I chose, I couldn't decide which was the most, for me, which was the most important, so I've chosen two. One of them being the Whitworth Art Gallery, which I was taken to when I was at school. I went to Manchester Grammar, where they desperately tried to educate me, and they failed quite badly. Not their fault, that was down to my fault, discovering the Hacienda, but that's a different story which led me into this car park today. But the Whitworth Art Gallery was introduced to me by my art teacher, a guy called Mr. McGuinness, and it was fascinating. They've got over 55,000 different pieces in there. Obviously you can't exhibit them all at the same time, but it's a place where you can spend all day now. Especially recently, it's had a refurb, which I think opened about 12 to 18 months ago. And it's the contemporary mixed with the old now. The contemporary, which is glass and steel, mixed with the old Jacobean building. And I would definitely spend quite a few hours there. You can just get lost in there. And finally, I'll finish waffling on. I think you can't visit Manchester without seeing Manchester's new contemporary space called Home, which I think is a great name. It's Home, and it houses, it's a contemporary space for arts, for media, for visuals, and the building itself is just incredible. It's well worth going into. And Home came about because you used to have the Library Theatre below the Central Library in Manchester, which is also another amazing building. And that combined with the Corner House, the two of them last year moved into Home. It's in a really special place. And the nice thing about it, which sort of ties it up, is Home is its address is Tony Wilson Square, which, if you don't know, Tony Wilson and Rob Gretton own Factory Records. Factory Records opened the most famous club in the UK, if not possibly the world, which was in Manchester. It was the Hacienda. And without the Hacienda, and without Rob Gretton, Tony Wilson, Factory Records and the Warehouse Project, PARKLIFE and a lot of Manchester's musical heritage wouldn't exist to this day.